This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Empire, madness, romance, and of course, a very tragic end. Sebag Montefiore is here to talk about his new book, The Romanovs, 1613 to 1918.
The great thing about doing all of them is really a way to show Russian continuity. How do we get to Russia today? Why Putin? Why Syria? Why Ukraine? Why does Russia have an autocracy today?
Who doesn't like a good read-aloud? We'll talk about new audio versions of two beloved children's classics, Alice in Wonderland and Grimm's Fairy Tales.
With fairy tales, the more sort of subdued the narrator is, I think actually the more effective they are as audio recordings.
Plus, the latest literary news and books we liked, even if our reviewers didn't. When you think about the Romanovs, chances are you think of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and of course, Nicholas and his entire family being executed by the Bolsheviks. But the Romanovs ruled Russia for 300 years. Sebag Montefiore, biographer of Stalin and Catherine the Great, has written extensively about Russia and is here to talk about his history of Russia's most famous imperial family. Simon, great to have you.
Hi, lovely to be with you.
Lovely to have you. So you've written a book already about one of the Romanovs, about Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And, of course, the subtitle of your Stalin biography was The Court of the Red Tsar. How did you decide to do all of the Romanovs together? I mean, this is 24 czars and tsarinas, and I'm probably forgetting a few people in there. Why do all of them?
We know some of them very well as kind of almost historical brand names, like Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Nicholas and Alexandra. But we know them in isolation. They've all entered the sort of that elevated level of being kind of almost media icons, almost Hollywood legends. And in fact, the view of all of even those well-known ones, I think, is wrong. And in the book, you'll see fresh and a different analysis of them that is very different from the sort of the cliche, the romance, the legend. But the great thing about doing all of them, even the lesser-known ones, is really a way to show Russian continuity. And that's one of the big themes of this book is, how do we get to Russia today? Why Putin? Why Syria? Why Ukraine? Why does Russia have an autocracy today? Why do the Russian people still yearn for a sort of imperial greatness? All these things are answered in this book and can only be answered by showing how Russia develops. And doing it through the monarchs, especially in an autocratic one-man rule system, is a very good way of showing how things develop.
What are the family characteristics, if there are any?
The answer is not a cliche. They are larger than life. And the reason why it's not a cliche is because they were literally a sort of family of giants
right.
for much of the period. I mean, Peter the Great and his father, Tsar Alexei, were both over 6 foot tall. Peter the Great was almost 6'7". So he was literally a giant, to say larger than life, flamboyant, brutal, cruel, brilliant, visionary, half monster, half genius. His father was very similar, and then when you get to the 19th century monarchs, from Alexander I, Nicholas I, Alexander II, Alexander III, they are all also enormously tall. They all look like czars are meant to, and to be a czar was an amazing thing. You had to be a big, swaggering, frightening, awesome character, majestic, and they all sort of fitted that bill perfectly.
When you were researching them, I mean, how easy is that? Have the Russians opened up? Are there archives about the Romanovs accessible? Did they keep all of their records?
I mean, this book is based on thousands upon thousands of sort of state papers, diplomatic papers, diaries, memoirs, and much of this is in the archives, or always in 19th century journals, printed 19th century journals, now pretty obscure. They kept their archives. Obviously, some stuff was destroyed. The Bolsheviks, when they took power, were religious and diligent about keeping everything. This book is really based around some amazing private and really amazing correspondences between Peter the Great and his wife, Catherine I, Catherine the Great's love letters that are also highly political, and really also letters of state, as well as sex, with Prince Potemkin. Potemkin, her partner in power. And then you jump forward. Of course, you've got Nicholas and Alexandra's extraordinary correspondence that is both political, sexual, and also, frankly, on the verge of being lunatic. And it's sort of when you read it, as you'll see from the book. And then you have a correspondence like Alexander II with his mistress, Princess Katya Dolgoruka, which has never really been used before because it's only just recently been returned to the Russian archives. It is extraordinary. It's political, it's poignant, it's a love correspondence, but it's also the most sexually explicit correspondence ever written by a politician anywhere, ever, I think.
You're very cleverly dangling all of this sex and romance and intrigue to get past anyone's, block to reading a big book about a political dynasty. But how did the Romanovs come to power to begin with? Who came before them?
Ivan the Terrible came before them, essentially, and he was of the Rurikid dynasty, which is an ancient Slavic dynasty that had ruled in Kiev and then had broken into many, many disparate parts that formed all the sort of Russian principalities that were gradually collected together by the grand princes of Moscow, and that dynasty lasted for many centuries until Ivan the Terrible murdered his own son, who was his heir. But this son was the child of Ivan the Terrible and his favorite first wife, and she was Anastasia Romanov. They were just a boyar family, a middle-ranking boyar family, but this way they entered into the royal family. When Ivan the Terrible died and Russia descended into total chaos, a failed state with many countries invading and carving up the country, they turned ultimately to the last vestige, the last connection to the traditional dynasty, and that was Anastasia's great-nephew, Michael Romanov. And he had the advantage of being young, innocent, alone. His father was in prison. So he was a kind of malleable and innocent, perfect, meek, saintly boy, embellished with the connection to the dynasty. And they turned to him and elected him Tsar. And that was how the Romanovs came to power in 1613.
And was it an auspicious start? How effective was he?
It was a very inauspicious start. And the strange thing was, at a time of total war and total disintegration, you'd have thought that they would turn to a sort of giant, swaggering warlord. But instead they turned to this meek boy. And in a way, that was his advantage. Like the high priest choosing King David in the Bible, an example of which they were kind of consciously copying. He was it was his innocence and weakness that in a way convinced everybody that he was the right person. But the chances of him succeeding were virtually nil, and him and his mother resisted desperately taking the throne. And when they finally accepted it, it didn't look like he would ever succeed. But in fact, gradually the Russians turned back the Poles, the Swedes, the Tartars, and began to re-establish the integrity of Russia. And then once that was done, they could begin to reconquer places like Ukraine.
And how much of that was attributable to Michael Romanov himself, and how much was it about sort of the people around him?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, very little was attributable to him, except the fact that he continued to convey exactly the pious honesty and innocence that was expected of a Tsar, sort of fantasy version of a Tsar.
I think fantasy probably is a key word there.
Yeah, but he was that. He and his son Alexei, the second one, were both kind of incredibly pious. They proudly would pull off 1,000 genuflections and prostrations, in an hour or something during festivals, and stay up all night. And this was, it was almost a religious monarchy, and it was very important at that stage. But the son was much more able than the father, Alexei, the second Tsar, and he showed himself to be a very effective warlord.
Can you situate for us a little bit what imperial rule was like for a Romanov Tsar compared with the other ruling imperial dynasties of Europe at the time?
Well, the strange thing was that, we always think of the Romanovs becoming incredibly kind of obsolete with this kind of autocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, and especially by the 20th. But actually, in the 17th century, they weren't that dissimilar. All monarchies in Europe were based on this idea of divine right, sacred autocracy, and all of them were trying to achieve that. I mean, Louis XIV later on in that century was. And in England, Charles I was trying to impose that on England. So the ideas behind it weren't as foreign as they later became, but the intense religiosity and cultural isolation of Muscovy was what really distinguished it. And also, the influence of the Mongols, the Tartars, because when you look at the court of Michael and Alexei, many of their leading courtiers were actually born Muslim, Tartars or Circassians, so there was a hugely strong kind of Mongol influence, which was very different.
Is the story of the Romanovs a kind of trajectory, like a Budensbrück-like trajectory of a family in decline, or what's the narrative kind of arc of the Romanov?
Well, we always think of them as a sort of cursed family, and certainly there was a lot of violence in this book. 6 of the last 12 Romanovs were murdered in one way or another, but they were often murdered by their own family and by their own, parents, their own wives, fathers, sons. Well, it's just interesting that, one always thinks of them being overthrown by popular revolt. In fact, out of the whole dynasty, only Nicholas II was overthrown by a popular revolt. Actually, they weren't a dynasty in decline. I mean, they were really ascendant and incredibly successful. And most of them were pretty able monarchs, considering the lottery of genealogy and family and biology. They were increasing the empire by something like 55 square miles a day for over 300 years. By the middle of the 19th century, they ruled a sixth of the world's surface. They are actually not cursed, but the most successful dynasty of modern times. The most successful by far, really, since Genghis Khan.
Well, that leads me, I think, to my last question about Putin. Is there any wisdom, any insight into Putin and his current rule of Russia that you came to in doing the research and writing this book?
There's really a lot that rebounds on Putin, and the book ends. The book really takes it up through Stalin, and then Yeltsin, right up to Putin, and it's so relevant because President Putin himself is so aware of the history. He regards himself as a successor to the successful statesman of Russian history. He doesn't differentiate with ideology. He thinks the two weakest and most pathetic rulers of Russia were Gorbachev and Nicholas II, while he identifies with great Romanov czars, who he would mention as people like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Nicholas I, Alexander I, who took Paris, and of course Stalin, who he regards as a great czar, not as a sort of communist figure, ideologue at all. So Romanov history is very relevant to him. The church history, the idea of sacred Russia is also very dear to him, and that was very much a Romanov idea too. And he really kind of follows the same kind of Romanov rules of autocracy, which is that, in return for security at home and prosperity at home, the autocrat and a tiny clique are able to become extremely rich and to make decisions in secret. But the people also expect kind of spectacular, prestigious empire and strength abroad. That was how the Romanovs justified autocracy, and that was how Putin does too. And as for sort of Ukraine, the Romanov dynasty spent the first half of my book conquering Ukraine. They annexed Crimea, and then they turned to making Russia a Near Eastern power. They wanted to take Constantinople, they wanted Jerusalem, and they were very interested in the Arab world. And in 1772, for example, Catherine the Great actually bombarded Syria and occupied Beirut. So even Syria is very much in the Romanov tradition, and that's how Putin sees himself, as a hybrid between a Romanov Tsar and a great General Secretary of the Soviet Empire.
Well, you make a very persuasive case for Putin as contemporary Tsar, for better, or perhaps mostly for worse.
Yes, exactly. For worse, I think.
Yeah.
If you think about what Russia sees itself as exceptionalist, as an empire, leading a strong ruler. What Putin's really trying to do is trying to make Russia great again. And that's very familiar at the moment in the U.S. presidential election, of course.
I feel like the subtitle of this book could have been 1613 to 2016 then.
Exactly.
The book, again, is The Romanovs, 1613 to 1918 by Simon Sebag Montefiore. Simon, thank you so much.
Thank you. That was such fun.
Alexandra Alter is here now to talk to us about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So what's the big news today?
So this week, Random House announced an upcoming publication. It's actually an old one. It's Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which was a huge bestseller when it came out in 2003. They're releasing a young adult version of it, which is kind of an abridged version that they're hoping teens will like. And I thought that was kind of an interesting move, considering that so many novelists have moved over into the young adult space, but most of them are writing new books for young readers. You know, you have James Patterson, John Grisham, Jane Smiley.
You know, the interesting thing is that there have been YA versions of a lot of nonfiction books that are adapted for young readers, and we actually review in our issue this week the audio versions of those. So, for example, Susan Cain's Quiet, there's a YA version now. There's a Boys in the Boat YA version. Michael Pollan's book, there's a YA version. I can sort of see that more with nonfiction. Fiction is a little bit more surprising.
It is surprising.
Adaptation.
Absolutely. And yeah, no, I've noticed that trend in nonfiction, particularly with big biographies of presidents or controversial or difficult issues. It makes sense to have an abridged and maybe somewhat sanitized young adult reader.
Do you think it's just a marketing tactic to kind of just get more interest in that book?
I mean, that's certainly got to be one aspect of it. The book has sold 82 million copies.
I'm just curious. I have not read it. I'm just echoing what a lot of the mocking tweets are saying online on social media that, like, well, how hard was that book?
Right. I mean, the first wave of responses to the announcement that they were releasing a teen version of the Da Vinci Code was, for example, I'll quote a piece in The Guardian by Sam Jordison. The Da Vinci Code is about to be dumbed down, period, even further. I mean, those are some of the snarkier aspects. Again, it's a long book. I did read it when it came out, and it's gripping. The chapters are short. There's a lot of action. Perhaps his publisher felt that it could be trimmed down, abridged a little bit to get even more young readers. And the language isn't that difficult, but there is a good deal of violence, and I wonder if they're going to tone some of that down a little bit.
But kids
too.
love violence.
It's true. I mean, the Hunger Games. Come on. Kids killing kids. So Dan Brown's comment that he gave out through his publisher was that his parents were educators and that he's himself is fascinated with history and art history, and that if he wasn't an author, he would have been a teacher. And so he felt like this was a way to sort of bring young readers into his oeuvre a little bit more. But it is interesting. I mean,
he's a super smart guy. He went to Amherst and roomed with Harlan Coben, another super smart writer.
Yeah. But, I'm wondering if we'll see more authors do this. I mean, up until now, the authors that have decided that they're going for the younger market have written new books that are specifically targeting those readers. But why not? Maybe we'll see Infinite Jest for the middle grade reader. Or...
I want a picture book version of the Da Vinci Code.
Actually, that would be great. There's a ton of symbols in there, as you know.
All right. Coming soon. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks, Pamela.
With audiobooks, we all get to listen to stories, even if they aren't primarily about the pictures. With audiobooks, people of all ages get to listen to stories, even books that aren't primarily about the pictures. But there's still something immensely pleasurable about turning to the tales we all know very well from childhood. 2 new versions of Grimm's Fairy Tales and Alice in Wonderland boast some major star power and are definitely aimed at readers or listeners of all ages. Our reviewer Laura Miller is here to talk about them. Hi, Laura.
It's great to be here.
So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is read by Scarlett Johansson, which I think probably makes them sound a little bit different than most people are used to hearing them. How is she as a narrator?
She shows a lot of aptitude for it. She creates distinct performances for each character, and she manages the sort of base narration very solidly. She has a little trouble with the accents. She's not really sure whether she wants to use English accents or not. So Alice doesn't have an English accent, but some of the other characters do.
You're saying she has a little trouble with acting.
No, it's
I'm just kidding.
It's just the accents.
Yeah.
But I would say she's above average as a narrator.
Let's listen to ScarJo.
"Would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, why you are painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice. "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So, you see, miss, we are doing our best afore she comes to—" At this moment 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces.
Another thing that I think helps make this performance feel liberated, or at least very confident, is that it was directed by her sister, Vanessa Johansson, who is apparently a well-known voice actress herself.
Well, she obviously has experience doing just voice from movies like Her and that kind of thing. But it's an interesting match. I don't know anything about the backstory. Do you know in terms of how she was selected for this?
No, but Audible Studios, which recorded this, has been engaged in a long project of getting movie stars to narrate classic works of literature and fiction. And so you can listen to Colin Firth narrate Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, or Susan Sarandon do A Member of the Wedding.
And actually, I think in this week's issue, we have a review by Gillian Flynn of Emma Thompson reading Henry James's Turn of the Screw.
Right, which sounds fabulous.
Yes.
As a general rule, the more trained an actor is for the stage, the better they are at narrating audiobooks. And probably the weakest audiobook narrators are basically comic actors who don't make a practice of creating different characters in their performances, who rely on the same type of personality throughout.
Or maybe also like people that are comedians often require kind of like a comic, like an audience feedback. And when you're alone in the studio, maybe it's like...
Well, it's more just getting the cadences right. There's a certain way that you would narrate a passage of description, and then there's a way that you narrate dialogue, and there's a way that you use dialogue when the character's older or younger, or a member of a different gender. And there are ways of doing that. One of the big dangers in audiobook narration for male narrators is that they can make the female characters kind of sound like drag queens. And so it's a very sort of subtle skill that is, I think, goes underappreciated. And so it really requires, in some ways, maybe a more classical training, because that gives you a wider sort of toolbox to work from.
I want to say that for listeners who don't know this but are realizing just how learned Laura Miller sounds on this subject, that not only was she the longtime books critic for Salon and now a book critic for Slate, but she's also a huge audiobook listener.
I am.
And therefore a real coup to get her as a reviewer for this. In terms of the way that the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, this production, one of the major choices that a lot of audiobooks are making now is sort of how produced to have a story sound. Like, is this just Scarlett doing a straight reading, or did they put in sound effects or music?
There's just some music at the beginning and the end, which is pretty common. There are no special effects, really. And I personally think that if the text is strong enough, you really don't need that, and that stuff is more of a distraction than anything else.
Good. And another purist. So the other book that you reviewed was a collection of new renditions of Grimm's fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm, of course. This one not produced by Audible, but by Listening Library. Tell us a little bit about how this was put together and what the structure's like.
Well, this is one of a whole series of translations of a book that also went through many different editions. And this is sort of in the middle. I mean, for people who sort of follow Grimm's fairy tales, there's the original sort of very dark version when the brothers thought of themselves as collecting a bunch of folk tales for ethnographers, in other words, adults, and then the increasingly cleaned up and sort of moralized versions,
Disney versions,
yes, that they sort of edited and published in subsequent years when it became this hit as something for people to read to children or for children to read themselves. And so this is sort of in the middle. You know, the stories can have a lot of sex and violence in them, and this is like Baby Bear's bowl of porridge. It's sort of not either too hot or too cold.
So it's for the entire family.
Yeah, I would say so. There's nothing in there that's too shocking. And I think they've selected the less grisly, lascivious ones.
Yes. Although it's interesting, I want to just mention some of the stories that are in here because they chose some of the lesser known fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. So there are the obvious ones. You've got Cinderella and Rapunzel and Snow White and Rumpelstiltskin and Hansel and Gretel. But then I think there are some here that even Grimm's fans may not be as familiar with, like A Riddling Tale and Sweet Porridge and The Elves and the Six Swans.
They're actually more familiar than you might think because there are a lot of different fairy tales that are just variations on the same story, and so they have different names. There's a version of Cinderella that's called Ashputtel. The Bowl of Sweet Porridge, that's the story about the girl who's kind to an old lady who gives her a magical bowl that when she stirs it, it just makes an infinite amount of porridge until you tell it to stop. And then one day the girl goes out and her mother turns on the bowl and doesn't know how to switch it off, and the whole village gets full of porridge. And so that's kind of a familiar story that's been turned into
Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Yeah, it's the same basic type of story. And Six Swans is a story about a girl it's got an evil stepmother and a girl who has to go through all of these ordeals to save her 6 brothers who have been turned into swans. They're pretty classic tales in some ways. There's one in there that's a little bit unusual in that it has Adam and Eve in it. That one is called Eve's Various Children, and that's read by Roy Dotrice. And that's really unusual in the Grimm's collection in that it involves biblical characters instead of your usual sort of anonymous peasants and royalty characters that we think of as being in fairy tales.
They've got some big names here as readers. People who are serious Harry Potter listeners will, of course, know Jim Dale well. And here he reads Rumpelstiltskin. How is he with that story?
He's always great. I mean, he just narrating the Harry Potter books, he became a huge star in his own right. Drew crowds and autograph seekers. And, people love Jim Dale because he is the voice through which many of them received one of the most loved children's books of our time.
Let's listen to a little clip then of Jim Dale doing Rumpelstiltskin.
So there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for the life of her she could not tell what to do. She had no idea how straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more frightened, until at last she began to weep. But all at once the door opened, and in came a little man, and said,
"Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?"
"Alas," answered the girl, "I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it."
"What will you give me,"
said the mannequin,
"if I do it for you?"
And there's Roy Dotrice, who I just mentioned before, is the phenomenally talented narrator. I don't even want to say phenomenally talented and phenomenally skilled narrator of the George R.R. Martin series, A Song of Ice and Fire, better known as Game of Thrones. That's a series of books that has 1,000 named characters. So you can imagine how many different voices this guy has to have created to narrate these books. He's incredible.
Keep track of them.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's amazing.
And now let's listen to a bit of Roy Dotrice reading Eve's Various Children.
When Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, they were compelled to build a house for themselves on barren ground and eat their bread in the sweat of their brow. Adam dug up the land, and Eve spun. Every year Eve brought a child into the world, but the children were unlike each other, some pretty and some ugly. After a considerable time had gone by, God sent an angel to them to announce that he was coming to inspect their household. Eve, delighted that the Lord should be so gracious, cleaned her house diligently, decked it with flowers, and strewed rushes on the floor. Then she brought in her children, but only the beautiful ones.
There are a couple of other big-name Hollywood people. One of them is Alfred Molina, who reads The Shoes That Were Danced to Pieces. I feel like he is so versatile, but I've never heard him read an audiobook. How does he do?
He is great. I mean, one of the weird things that I discovered in listening to this recording is that sometimes the people that I think of as the most accomplished and interesting and exciting audiobook narrators that I'm just like, oh, yes, this one's done by Simon Vance, or those people don't necessarily do as good a job as, because they're more used to doing what I just praised Roy Dotrice for, which is coming up with a bunch of different character voices or characterizations. With fairy tales, the more sort of subdued the narrator is, I think actually the more effective they are as audio recordings.
All right, let's listen to a little bit of Alfred Molina reading The Shoes That Were Danced to Pieces.
There was once upon a time a king who had 12 daughters, each one more beautiful than the other. They all slept together in one chamber, in which their beds stood side by side, and every night when they were in them, the king locked the door and bolted it. But in the morning, when he unlocked the door, he saw that their shoes were worn out with dancing, and no one could find out how that had come to pass.
I feel that fairy tales are sort of best read not as a dramatic performance, but rather as a monologue.
Mm-hmm.
That this, listening to this recording, made me realize that there's only really one character really in fairy tale, and that's the narrator.
Yes.
And that voice, that kind of voice that just feels like it's coming down through time, it's elemental, it's primal, it's almost in a way universal. And yet for many of us, it's also really specific because there's one or two people in our childhood who read to us. And that is a very unusual character, this narration that doesn't really have a name or a body or a shape, but is really just anyone who's ever told us a story. The less these recordings subtracted from that, the more powerful they
right. It can kind of become too intrusive if it's sort of too
and also,
performative.
Yeah, because the characters in fairy tales, I'm going to do air quotes around it, the characters in fairy tales, they're pretty one-dimensional. So you get these sort of cackling witches or kind of insipid maidens, and doing too much of a performance of those characters kind of just draws attention to how sort of thin they are, whereas the tales themselves are very rich and full. And so a more sort of unified narration just brings you back again to the telling, which is, I think, where all the power comes from.
It's so perfectly suitable for Grimm's fairy tales, which, of course, began as oral stories.
Yes, exactly.
And, it's interesting in a very different way. I wonder if Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is, in a very different way, suited to an audio recording because so much of it is wordplay and poetry, or if it become confusing because of that?
No, I mean, there are many recordings of this book, and the only real exception that I take to this particular one is that it's really just not that necessary. I mean, you can hear Fiona Shaw read it, or you can hear Christopher Plummer read it, or you can hear Jim Dale read it. And so you don't really need to hear Scarlett Johansson read it. And it's hard for me to imagine any kid really caring that much about Scarlett Johansson.
They're not huge ScarJo fans when you're 6 years old.
Yeah, they're probably much more excited about Jim Dale. I will say that Scarlett Johansson sings the Mock Turtle song very well.
She's a lovely singer.
Yeah, she's one of the better Mock Turtle singers I've heard in my time, because it's a ridiculous song that involves singing Beautiful Soup.
All right, the books again are Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, of course, and read by Scarlett Johansson, and Grimm's Fairy Tales by, of course, the Brothers Grimm, read by various readers, including Jim Dale and Alfred Molina, among many others. And both of them are reviewed this week in our audiobook section of the book review by Laura Miller. Laura, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
To talk about this week's bestsellers and our editor's choices, the books we here at the Book Review liked, even when our reviewers didn't, my colleagues from the Book Review, Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with what other people are reading. What's on the bestseller list this week, Greg?
In fiction, the only new title is by Louise Erdrich. Her new novel, La Rose, joins some other literary heavy hitters on the list. Richard Russo is still there. Don DeLillo still there. Of course, Anthony Doerr is still there. After more than 2 years, All the Light We Cannot See is at number 10.
I'd like to claim credit for La Rose being on the bestseller list this week since she's on our cover, but that's this week too, so we can't say that we did it.
Louise Erdrich, she actually is a regular on the list these days. She's got a growing audience, a large and growing audience. So for somebody with such a major reputation, she's also got a wide popular following.
And weirdly, we seem to have covered the nonfiction newcomers this week as well.
It's true. All three of the new titles in nonfiction have recently been reviewed in the book review. Starting up at number 5, Nathaniel Philbrick's new one, Valiant Ambition. Of course, he's also a best-selling regular. Valiant Ambition is the story of Benedict Arnold and his relationship with George Washington, but it's kind of the account of his treason during the Revolution.
And actually, I should clarify, number 12, The Big Picture by Sean Carroll. We have not reviewed yet, so I've just given something away. We shall be reviewing.
We are planning a review of Sean Carroll's The Big Picture. Sean Carroll is a physicist, so he joins the theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli, whose 7 Brief Lessons on Physics is still on the list at number 16. Yeah, all these books about theoretical physics. Yeah. People can't get enough. Yeah. The Big Picture, also about theoretical physics, looking at the universe.
I prefer to watch the movies. All right.
That's new at number 12. And at number 14, the popular historian Max Hastings has a book called The Secret War, which looks at the rise of the intelligence state and the use of intelligence during World War II.
I'm not going to bore everyone with the last 100 pages of Les Miserables, which is where I am, and instead turn to Parul, reading 2 of my favorite things, baby books and Zoe Heller.
So I'm immensely, vastly pregnant right now with my first. So the last couple of months I've just been mainlining pregnancy books. And it's been rather fun to discover a new genre sort of later in life and to be like, oh, these are the classics. These are the sort of eccentric outliers. And you sort of find your people and find your, I don't know, not philosophy, but whatever. It's been a lot of fun. But I think last week I realized I've OD'd. I can have no more advice. I can have no more instructions or injunctions to be virtuous, to eat this or that. I'm done. So I think it was like 2 days ago, I was like, I need something like a palate cleanser. I need something astringent.
Bracing.
I need something with people behaving badly. So
while you're smoking and drinking.
With children. So I picked up a favorite book of mine, which I haven't read in like 7 years, but I used to read it every year. It's Zoe Heller's Notes on a Scandal, which was made into a very good movie, but the book is just sublime. I actually think it's a perfect novel. It's like lean, mean. Again, the premise I'm sure most people know is it's a pottery teacher becomes romantically and sexually involved with a student and starts confiding in this very creepy older teacher at the school who sort of seems to develop
a female
teacher develops an obsession with the sort of story and with this younger woman. And it's one of those books where you feel like every psychological insight actually feels fresh and strange and funny. And every sentence is just delicious and barbed. And it's, after like...
Zoe Heller can do no wrong.
She can do no wrong. I mean, like, she's one of our Bookends columnists. People have read her criticism and her reviews, but it's really something to go back to her novels and just see what she herself can do on the page.
I love her first novel, Everything You Know, and I love the fact that she chose as her sort of narrator this really unlikable, kind of irascible older man. And it isn't until well into the book that she reveals the title, and it's just this old couple that she sees arguing in this hotel lobby, and the man, I think, is kind of bossing his way through, and the wife grumbles at him, everything you know, everything you know, which I finally understood. I said, that's how you say the title, which of course could be read in many ways.
Yeah. No, she's pretty remarkable. she's just truthful in a way that when you read her, and I think people feel this about her criticism too.
That
She just
comes
says
through
things,
in her criticism,
right? That
yeah.
like, you're like, oh no, that's what everybody's a little too nervous to say or a little bit too polite to say, and she can do so with like in such a memorable, delicious way. So yeah, that's where I'm getting my respite from.
All right, and
that
Greg,
stuff.
what are you reading?
I'm reading a book that doesn't come out until August, so our listeners will just have to make note of it and track it down then. It's sort of a memoir through mini essays by a writer, really an editor named Terry McDonnell. He's been a longtime magazine editor. He's worked at Rolling Stone and Newsweek and Esquire and Sports Illustrated. And this is kind of looking back at his life as an editor.
What's the title?
It is called The Accidental Life. It comes out in August. Partly talks about the writers that he's known and worked with. There's a nice bit on Jim Harrison in there. He writes about Kurt Vonnegut. Also, subjects and famous people that he's come into encounter with. There's a little thing about Steve Jobs, early in Steve Jobs' career when he was still in his 20s. And then he also writes about writing subjects. So, there's he has a short page on writer's block, for instance, and he says that when he was an editor and not a writer, he used to tell people, no, there's no such thing as writer's block. Come on, turn your copy in. But now that he's been writing, he's much more sympathetic.
He suddenly discovered
writer's block. There's a funny line in that one that reminds me of a line from a book I talked about last week from Noah Hawley's Before the Fall. In Before the Fall, Noah Hawley quoted Jack LaLanne saying, I hate exercise, but I like the results. And in this writer's block thing, Terry McDonnell quotes Gloria Steinem saying, I hate writing, but I love having written. And it's that same idea that it's all about that the process is not so fun, but the results are fun.
I love reading books by editors, but I hate that they're always writing about periods where, it was so much better to be an editor. It's like you read
glamour and
H.L. Mencken, My Life as an editor and writer, and he's, lunching at Delmonico's, and you think, why don't we do that?
And of course, as a former magazine editor, Terry McDonnell has a lot to say about the decline of magazines, the rise of the internet, and kind of what an uncertain period it is for all of us.
Yeah, where's our lunch account? All right, thanks so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.